All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here. Very excited to have as my guest, Chesarae Hall-Fletcher. Chesarae, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So originally from Oakland, California, Chesarae Fletcher inherited a rich faith heritage. Granddaughter of the late Bishop Vernon Robinson, she began her study of scripture in the African-American Holiness Pentecostal tradition. This early spiritual legacy birthed a deep hunger for intimacy with Christ's Spirit and His Word, which led her into over 22 years of the academic study of theology. Professor Fletcher earned her undergraduate degree from San Francisco State University, followed by an MA in Biblical Studies in 2017 and an MA in Theology in 2019. Currently, Professor Fletcher teaches church history and graduate research methods at Epic Bible College and leads Sabbath and spiritual formation retreats throughout the region. All right, Chesarae, I just moved from Oakland to Bend, Oregon. Where are you living now?
I'm actually in Sacramento.
Okay.
Yeah, but I went through Bend, Oregon. Portland Seminary is where I got my master's in theology from. So I just learned to love Oregon. It's so beautiful. So I could understand.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. So let's touch base here. Let's dive down. Before we started recording, I had kind of referenced our initial communications of how we came together. And when I kind of heard about what you were doing, it just seemed like a no-brainer for you to have you come on this podcast, especially in the world in which we're living now, when you're talking about listening and the importance of that and so forth. And let me start off by asking you, what drew you to the importance of listening, and I guess tie that into where trauma fits in with that.
Absolutely. So basically, my interest initially was just looking at local clergymen, chaplain, and seeing how they fit into the society in a very unique position, because they fit into the society in terms of connecting with residents for medical issues, for job issues, for psychological issues, for family issues, and wondering how they held all that together. And I was looking at resilience initially. But when I started getting closer to it, I wanted to look at how well they were actually listening to their communities, as opposed to what we usually think of as people sitting in the pews and listening to them. Mm-hmm. And so as I started to try to turn those speakers and change that soundscape, I realized that there was this gap, I should say, in the research on how well clergymen listen to the pews. Lots of research on how well the pews listen to preachers, clergymen, chaplain. And I just wanted to investigate how they listened to people who were experiencing trauma. What I found really quickly was, before I could look at how they were listening to others, I just hit a wall with how they were listening, period.
Okay.
And the biggest—
Now, let me interrupt you for a second, just quickly. When you say listening, what do you mean?
Good question. So I'm coming from a biblical framework, and there's a word called the Shema. It's to hear, but in the Hebrew understanding, or the Old Testament Hebrew understanding, to listen is not, to hear is not really just sound coming into your ear, it's trailing, right? How well are you trailing? How well are you taking in, understanding the context and the content that's been given to you, and then doing something in response to what you've heard? So it's responsive hearing or responsive listening. And I realized really quickly that for a lot of reasons that we can maybe unpack today, they were struggling big time. And then I hit their trauma. So initially I wanted to trail how they heard trauma, but I hadn't even dealt with vicarious trauma, which came up really quickly. And that's what brought me to your work.
This is fascinating. I'm so glad you're here. And when I read that, I was like, yes. So first of all, before we get into that, and that just sounds like so amazing to unpack, as you said, how did you get here? What brought you into this awareness and field and passion and interest?
Thank you. So I grew up, as I said, as a PK, or my grandfather is a bishop of a Pentecostal church, or was. He passed away a few years ago. But they had this fellowship circle. And so the fourth Saturday of every month, they would get together either in Willows or I think it was Lemoore, Bakersfield, or Bay Area, really, not only Sacramento, Bay Area, Richmond. And they had these wonderful fellowship circles that started in like the 70s. And literally that we would stay at the parishioners' houses, and I would sit with my grandfather and listen to these stories that they would kind of share about their experiences being in this ministerial role. So I heard all kinds of stories. And what happened when I got into college, I wanted to go back and look at that. And I realized that the timeline of when that broke apart was also the timeline when I started to see my grandfather go through a lot of isolation and a lot of hardship personally after decades of really thriving in his role as a minister. And so I wondered, was there a connection between that circle of familiar experiences by these shared clergy pastor vocations? And I wanted to know, did that connect with the loss of it, connect with the isolation? Obviously you can say, well, it connected, but I wanted to look at that closer. And of course, mixing that with the community that he was serving, which is Richmond, it's a minority community, underserved community, struggling community. I started to look at what he was carrying, the load he was carrying, and really quickly it bumped into just when you listen together, there's more of an ability to have resilience and carry that listening than when you're listening to it by yourself. So that's what I wanted. I started out saying, let me look at the resilience of listening as a clergy person. And as I said, that kind of took me on this whole course of obstacles to listening. Once I realized so let me say this too. I started a project called Sacramento Theological Friendship Project. And I bought 9 clergy chaplains. Some of them were full-time pastors. Some of them were social justice advocates. And I asked them to walk with me through my research for 9 months, meeting about once every month. And let's talk about how they were experiencing listening. We talked about who they listened to the most. Once they realized, we talked about the importance of listening. And then they tracked who they listened to, who they didn't listen to, what was hard to hear, what did they find themselves listening to kind of voluntarily versus they didn't even realize they weren't listening at all to certain soundscapes. And that resilience piece kind of had to kind of get put on the back burner to the mechanics of the vocation. In today's world, a church operates a lot like a corporation, right? There's just so much to the machine of ministry. And so like any other entrepreneur, you got to keep that machine going. You've got social media, you're broadcasting your services live, you've got branding that's happening with your church. And so there's all of that angst, as well as you've got people in the pews that actually came to you for healing, right? Like any other trauma therapy. And that kind of is what led me to this research.
Awesome. Now, when you started, were you into this research before you got into school and started becoming educated?
Good question. So no. And that's the thing. A lot of times in the inner city, you have communities that churches, you have leadership that's never had the type of training that I was gifted. My pastor and my grandfather just happened to be one that always said, get some fat on your head. And that meant get education. So he had an education. Most of his peers did not. But I wasn't into it before. Pentecostals are not known for our gift of ears. It's more the gift of tongues that we talk about a lot. And so developing that gift of ears was something that I saw real quickly was needed. And so I would not have realized that if I hadn't gotten to some other traditions like, what is the tradition? I'm seeing them in my head. Oh, Quakers, thank you.
Okay, right.
Quakerism and a lot of silence and solitude. And I started to attend spiritual formation retreats and read some monastic books from the past, people from way back medieval period time, and just understanding that role that was a part of the faith tradition of silence and listening together and understanding in that tradition, understanding that kind of like Parker Palmer talks about this bigger other. So if you're listening to it in today's world of a fix it type A personality is very different than if you're kind of partnering with someone on their journey. And so it's that partner, but there's this bigger other that we identify with as spirit that's also, it has the muscle and the bandwidth to hold the heavy parts, versus you having to have the solutions. And that kind of gets crowded out if you're kind of detached from your own inner sphere. And unfortunately, just in the world we live in, and we can see it in the news daily, our churches are really struggling with listening even to each other right now.
Right. Yeah, the way you described listening is very similar, as you may or may not know, to what people talk about when they talk about the importance of listening in therapy. There's a difference between oftentimes newer therapists, myself included, when I was starting out, you have this idea, like, how to fix things because you've been going to school, and you want to kind of impose that on your clients instead of just sitting back and listening and understanding that the person sitting in front of you does have the knowledge and what the understanding to heal, essentially. But let's go back and kind of unpack what you found. This is really interesting to me. So in your research, in your work, what was it like kind of unpacking and seeing what was going on with listening, and how you said you were coming up against trauma, and even the clergy's their own trauma?
Yeah. So the first thing I have to say is I started to feel like I needed therapy training real fast, because these clergy, no one was really listening to them outside of their platform. Right. So we all have a platform that we stand on as professionals, and you kind of put on that hat and you operate in that role. So when I brought them together, what I heard them echo was that it was the first time where they didn't owe anybody anything in the room, and they weren't needed for anything. They didn't have to fix anything. And we did a couple of retreats where we went away, we got out of the city, and we went to some Catholic retreat centers, and we just sat around in a room and we just kind of breathed. And we had some Naptio Divina, which is a spin on Lectio Divina. It's kind of like, go take a nap. That's your spiritual practice right now. Go to sleep.
Right.
They were tired. They were weary. And these people who didn't even know each other before this event started to share. And it's like, I think it resonated that they were all having the same experience. And what I realized was that I had to create a safe space for them to just say, this is hard. And they realized that they were not functioning at that peak. And they had some struggle even with, how do I get there? And at the same time, how much do I share that I'm not there yet, with those around me on my staff or the people that sit in the pews in front of me. And then they look to me like, okay, how do we do this? And I was like, I'm just trying to study, and so then they pushed me to go and research more how to practice listening. And that's where I talked about, they practice noticing who they listened to and who they didn't listen to. That one was a big one. And why was it easier to listen to some people, and why was it harder to listen to other people? And one of the things that we hit really quickly was that a big obstacle, the initial big obstacle, was just the machine of ministry today. But the second big obstacle is they didn't realize when they got into the vocation that they needed listening skills, and they had no resource to develop them. They didn't have what I call a theology of listening. So we talk about listening to God, but God listens. So there's this prayer, it's like the known prayer in Judaism. It's Hear, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. That's how it starts. It's the Shema. They say it, I think, 3 or 4 times a day. But when you go to that word in Old Testament scripture, God is the first person that shemas. So God is the first person that listens. And so when you think of that positioning that clergy put themselves in a way, kind of as like a reflecting God, right? These image bearers, as we call it, we should be listening first, but we've been trained to preach. We've been trained to lead. We've been trained to administer. We haven't been trained how to listen. And the interesting thing is that when you read the text, the first person that God listens to is a Black immigrant. And so we went through this whole theology that for them gave validity to, when I say, who are you listening to? Because it's Hagar. Hagar has been forced to have a sexual relationship with a man, Abraham, that she doesn't necessarily concede to. She has to do it. And then after she has a child for him, she gets kicked into the desert and she's weeping because her child is about to die. And the Bible says that God heard her cry. So we started to look at that with clergy, like who's crying around us, and are we listening to the groans? This Trevor Hudson is an Anglican South African pastor who has this, it's almost like a TED Talk type style lecture that he does on YouTube called Listening to the Groans. And so we trailed that scripture text that he uses to say, what are the groans around you and how are you listening? But I kept having to go back to, what are the groans within you? And how are those groans affecting how you listen to others? And I had people that literally quit their jobs, not necessarily their ministry jobs, but their secular jobs, because they realized they were in social justice and they were really experienced vicarious trauma. Didn't have a name for it before that time, but they realized that they were hardening themselves because they had to keep going after listening, especially in the criminal justice system. Those that were working on criminal justice reform, they just were full. So they had to just step back from the whole thing and just kind of deal with some inner stuff that they hadn't even realized it came up. I had people that changed churches. They literally were like, I can't be in this role in this way anymore. I need to be developed. And so, not that I'm trying to get everyone to quit, but it just definitely, I think a lot of fruit came out of that time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, again, fascinating. And it really sounds like you did create a space, not only of safety, but one for reflection in areas that really hadn't been tapped into, or the light hadn't shone on in a way. I'm curious about, Chesarae, the topic of trauma, and the trauma that these clergy were able or willing or capable of speaking about. What was their response to that topic?
I think the biggest light bulb moment was that there was, I would call it a trauma of hope. That's how I talked about it in my thesis. Going into something very maybe idealistic, very excited, feeling like you've got God on your side, right? This is going to be, especially as a Pentecostal, everything can be done with the right prayer in a Pentecostal, and realizing that it's a journey, and realizing that the journey is kind of like, I gave the example of, my husband's a vegetarian. He's not a vegetarian because he decided 30 years to be. He's a vegetarian because when he woke up this morning, he chose to be a vegetarian again. And that's the type of commitment to listening that we have to take. Like, it can't just be, I went and took a workshop, or I read a book, or I did a class. It literally is a lifestyle, a listening lifestyle, where you say, okay, how do I hold this all together? And that's why I think silence and solitude was such a big deal, because we just have a lot of noise in our world. And I think that was a part of their trauma of hope, was not feeling like they were incapable to really listen to all the sounds around them. That made them lose, in some ways, become a little cynical, maybe not every single person, but maybe even sometimes become cynical with the role that they thought they were going to do versus the role that they ended up with. And then you kind of deal with not feeling like it's going to change, right? So which kind of implies not necessarily feeling like you're being effective all the time, or as much as you anticipated you would be. They've asked me very strongly if we could try to get like some funding to keep the group going. It's something I would love to do. I'm actually working on my Ph.D. right now, which is kind of going into a different direction, but I think it's, I call it, there's like this need for care for caregivers. I'm sure you've heard of that, something like that. Of course,
yeah.
And I think it's vital. And as I look at even how, ministers have holding COVID, and how we're dealing even with some of the other racial tensions right now, I see, what I see is that same trauma that I saw in those pastors. It's just that now they're in the thick of it, and they don't have those listening skills developed. And so we're suffering. I see a lot of weakness. And I say that like sincerely, it's not like a criticism, but I see a struggle because we don't think of clergy the way we think of every other helper profession, such as doctors or psychiatrists. We understand clearly, even social workers, we understand the load that they carry and that they need training on how to listen to some of that. That's your whole role, right? I don't know how many clergy sign on to listen to you and understand clearly how your work intersects with theirs.
When you were talking to them about listening, the importance of listening, and the definition of listening, what was their response in terms of how they were able to reflect on their own, the people in their communities? Was, you talked a little bit, said a lot of times, or sometimes they felt like they weren't doing enough. I'm curious about that whole process, before they met you, what were they doing? What did they think they were doing relative to then meeting you and understanding this whole idea about listening?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. I think it does. So I think what they thought they were doing was just getting it done, get her done, as we said, keeping the ball rolling, squeaky wheel gets the oil. One of them had this term, ain't nobody got time for all that. She's just like, we don't have time for this. And listening takes time. Like that came up really quick too, just the pace of life and the need for Sabbath, which is what I'm working on now. And just As a whole nother offshoot of listening. I think they just had a lot of wow moments because from our framing, this being a faith network, I don't think, I think what that bigger other, Palmer's term, is really God who is listening. And so I think that put on them, for some, I think it gave them the permission to examine and say, how am I doing? If the big boss says I'm supposed to be doing this, then I can give myself permission to quiet my soundscape. I can give myself permission to calm my life, or to say no to things, or to walk away from things, because there's someone bigger than the social media that's clanging, or there's someone bigger than all the other demands that were getting in the way. And so I think that's why I feel it was crucial to have a theology of listening, so that they have permission to consider it and to reflect on it and to meditate on it. But the biggest response was just, wow. Wow, wow. We read books together, and came back and people shared like the parts that pulled on them the most to do it. And it was just, it was enriching, I think, for all of us.
To what degree did that experience change you, impact you?
Hugely, hugely. I'm kind of like anything I do, I jump in with both feet. And so everything that I was sharing with them, like I was eating the same meal at the same table. And I had, at the time I was parenting 2 teenagers, and realizing that, I heard someone say rules without relationship equals rebellion. And so a lot of what I was experiencing in my own home with my own teenagers, I realized was a part of that not listening, just kind of leading, and I had to come home and really just sit with some hard truths, because like one of them had already gone to college, like you can't get that time back. So you have to give yourself a lot of grace and a lot of mercy with how you've been listening up until now. And like I said, understanding is that there's that journey and there's that accountability. Once we have the training, or once we're developing on our way to walk in the hard work of changing, and it also, I think it changed me as a parent completely. Just, I still have kids at home, and I listen to them so much more than I did before. It changed me even politically. I think that before I kind of listened more to my soundscape, and I had to make sure that I was listening to the other side, or all the sides, even like, and like I said, who are you not listening to? I have to ask myself that question. And so I had to kind of push myself to be willing to enter into dialogue with people who didn't always agree with me on everything, on any side of the aisle. And just to understand that if I'm not listening to that, then I'm literally hearing one side of the story. I don't hear it even as clear as I think I am about it. And then I started this circle called Sabbath with My Sisters. And it's just once a month, myself and another one of the participants actually from that group, she was like, we need to do more. Like, we can't just let this end like this. And so we invited 14 women to kind of do this journey with us, where we get together once a month and we just talk about the journey of ceasing. People think of Sabbath as like a bath or a nap, depending on where you can identify with the word. But Sabbath just means, the first thing is to stop. Cease. There's this Hebrew term of the first letter of it means stop chewing, and it kind of, imagine chewing meat, and you're just a big piece of meat in your mouth. And so you have to stop chewing life so that you can catch up, or let your soul catch up with yourself. And I think that definitely connects to listening. And so it's hard. It's especially, times that are loud like now, it's hard, but it's been, again, very rewarding. And I think my kids like me more. So I think that they would say that I'm a better listener, but I still have some work to do.
I can't help but think, Chesarae, of this time that we're living in now, the crazy time. COVID, I'm talking about specifically.
Right.
How does this play into this crazy time? And crazy is not even a really good word. I mean, it's anxiety provoking, it's isolating, right? It's people are nervous, people are scared, we're trying to get through it. How does what you're talking about play into this? It just seems like it's even more important than ever.
Right, absolutely. I think it's those same 3 themes that I looked at in my thesis. And number one is just isolation was a big obstacle, for them. They were listening like solo. And I think right now more than ever, and it's right, more than ever, when you're supposed to not connect with people, you need that connection. You
Right.
really, I've lost two people to COVID just since you and I set up this appointment. And so that was very, very painful, but definitely having family connection was the thing that was the strength through it. So I think that that connection is huge, and that connection could be a circle that is of a familial circle, but it could also just be like a network that you have. Your job. I know some jobs that are intentionally, getting together online and having just check-ins and playing, games, virtual games and things. We need that. We need that outlet. It could even just be you and another person reading a book together, and they're reading it, and you guys are going to meet every Thursday at 7. It's kind of something that's helping you, because that leads to the second thing, which was they were struggling because they didn't have the skill set to do it. And I think that while we all have a little, we don't really have more time. We have more time back in March. Now we've kind of all figured out how to get back on the rat race, but making time to really just develop skills. I think you offer some wonderful skills. I read the book, The Age of Overwhelm, which I got that author through your work. Her name slips me right now. That was a good skill, just trying to unclutter as much as we can at this time, because you need your arms, you need your hands, you need your soul, just to really carry all this. And then the last thing was hope. You have to have hope. You have to have a bigger story that's bigger than this very big story that we're all experiencing. And for me, that comes directly from the text, the biblical text. But you have to have something that is a bigger other that you kind of anchor yourself in, beyond just people that, people are people. They're human, and they're not going to be perfect. Give them the grace that we give ourselves at this time. Give ourselves grace. Let me say that, because not all of us give ourselves grace. But give those people who we see like missing it, give them some grace and some space, but don't put our hope in them at the same time. Have a bigger other. And I think therapy is great. I've utilized it myself. It's been a huge help, just in isolating, in connecting myself and reconnecting with some parts of me that I just kind of put along on the side as I was going through 20 years of school and raising a number of kids and having a marriage and a business. And, I just I left some pieces of myself behind. And so back in March, when we had that big chunk of time, I definitely took some time, and I'm trying to continue on Saturdays every week to just collect those pieces and like puzzle pieces, and we really have to keep up with ourselves right now, I think.
You sound like you're on a mission.
Yeah, I think so.
What is that mission?
Ooh, that is a good question. So there's a theme that I just have realized recently, and is that I get that fulfillment when I help people see that there's something that can happen that they either never thought could happen, or they stop believing can happen, because it can happen. So you can call it a mission of hope. You can call it that. Also, I think I'm on a mission to repair an institution that I desperately love, and that's the church. I see that we're struggling. I don't think we were ever intended to be an institution. Institution, yes, in terms of, we need space and names so you can know where to stop, and addresses so you can know where to, come to. But I don't think we were intended to be what you see when you see us today. And so I am, I guess, on a mission to collect the pieces of that as well, and to relocate the soul of faith. And I think it starts with listening too.
That's awesome. Chesarae, as we wind down here, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm on all the things. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. I teach at Epic Bible College, which is in Sacramento, California. I'm easily findable there. And I can leave my contact information with you. I'm also, like I said, we launched Sabbath with My Sisters. It has been private, but as of 2021, it's going to be public. And so they Google January 1st, Sabbath with My Sisters, then they can find me there.
Okay. I'll have those. We'll get those links, and I'll have them on the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Chesarae, man, you are an inspiration, and you have this light that glows out of you, and it's sincere. I mean that sincerely. It's just awesome to have you on this podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate your work. Now, keep it up, please.
All right. Take care.
Okay.